What if everything you learned about Islam in Europe started in the wrong place? Most history books start the story in the modern era, millions of Muslims arriving in Europe over the last few decades. And that story is real, but it is not the whole story. Because Muslims were in Europe over 1,000 years ago. They built cities. They wrote books. They practiced science. They raised families. They prayed. They contributed. And then, history forgot them. Today, we are going to change that. Today, we are going to remember. Let's start with an island. A small island in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. You probably know it today as a tourist destination. Beautiful beaches, good food, warm weather. But in the year 827, something happened there that most people have never heard of. That island is Sicily, and for over 200 years, it was home to one of the most remarkable Muslim civilizations in European history. In 827, Muslim forces from North Africa crossed the sea and landed on the southern coast of Sicily. It took them decades to gain full control of the island. This was not a quick conquest. It was a slow, complicated process. But by the late 800s, they had established themselves, and what they built was extraordinary. The capital city was Palermo, and at its height, Palermo was one of the largest and most advanced cities in all of Europe. Historians estimate the population reached around 300,000 people. To put that in perspective, London at the same time had maybe 15,000 people. Paris was not much bigger. Palermo was in a completely different league. The city had public bathhouses. It had gardens. It had fresh running water brought in through underground channels. It had over 300 mosques. It had libraries, schools, and busy markets where goods from across the Mediterranean world were bought and sold. But here is the part that people find most surprising. Palermo was not just a Muslim city. It was a city where Muslims, Christians, and Jews all lived together. They were not always equal. No society in history has been perfectly equal. But they worked together. They traded together. They learned from each other. And when the Norman Christians reconquered Sicily in 1072, something unusual happened. Instead of erasing the Islamic culture, they absorbed it. The Norman kings were fascinated by Arab learning and art. They hired Muslim scholars to work in their courts. They built churches using Islamic architectural styles. You can still see the red Arab Norman domes in Palermo today. Some of their official government documents were written in 3 languages at the same time: Latin, Greek, and Arabic. One of the most remarkable examples of this is the story of Muhammad al-Idrisi. Al-Idrisi was a Muslim geographer and scholar from North Africa. King Roger II of Sicily, a Christian Norman king, invited him to his court and asked him to do something ambitious: create the most accurate map of the world that had ever been made. Al-Idrisi accepted. He spent 15 years gathering information from travelers, merchants, and sailors from across the known world. He interviewed people. He studied older maps. He calculated distances, and in 1154, he completed his work. A detailed map and a geographic encyclopedia that described the world as it was then known. It was called the Tabula Rogeriana, the Book of Roger. For centuries, it was one of the most accurate maps in existence. A Muslim scholar, working for a Christian king on a European island, producing a masterpiece of world knowledge. That is what Sicily was. And most people have never heard this story. Now let's move to the mainland, or more accurately, to the other end of the Mediterranean, to a place that is now called Spain and Portugal, but which for nearly 800 years was known by another name, Al-Andalus. You may have heard of it, but the way it is usually described does not do it justice. It gets reduced to a simple story, either a golden age of perfect harmony or a period of conquest and conflict. The truth, as always, is more human and more complicated than either version. So instead of talking about politics and battles, let's talk about people. Let's talk about al-Zahrawi. He was born around 936 CE in a town near Cordoba called Medina az-Zahara. He became a physician, one of the greatest physicians in the medieval world. Over his career, he wrote a medical encyclopedia in 30 volumes called Kitab al-Tasrif, the method of medicine. It covered surgery, medicine, pharmacology, and more. What made him extraordinary was not just what he knew, but how he thought. He believed that a doctor should observe patients carefully, keep records, and only write about what he had actually seen and tested himself. That sounds obvious to us now. But in the 900s, that kind of systematic, evidence-based thinking was radical. His surgical tools, many of which he designed himself, were copied and used by European surgeons for 500 years after his death. Doctors in England, France, and Italy were operating with instruments based on his designs long after Al-Andalus had disappeared, and Al-Zahrawi was not alone. In Cordoba, scholars worked on mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, and botany. The city's library system was legendary. The main library is estimated to have held around 400,000 manuscripts, at a time when most European monasteries considered themselves fortunate to have a few dozen books. Students came from across Europe to study in Cordoba, young men from France, from Germany, from England. They traveled south into Muslim territory because that was where the best education was. They learned Arabic so they could read the texts. They brought that knowledge back home with them. This is not a small detail. The intellectual foundations of the European Renaissance, the rediscovery of Greek philosophy, advances in mathematics and medicine, were significantly built on knowledge that came through Al-Andalus, through Muslim scholars who had preserved, translated, and expanded on ancient learning for centuries. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said, "Seeking knowledge is an obligation upon every Muslim." That hadith was not just a saying. It was a value that shaped entire civilizations. Then, in 1492, it ended. The last Muslim ruler of Granada, Muhammad XII, known in Spanish history as Boabdil, surrendered the keys of the city to the Spanish monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella. It was January 2nd, 1492. The same year Columbus sailed to the Americas. What followed was devastating. Libraries were destroyed. The Arabic language was banned. Muslims and Jews were given a choice: convert, leave, or die. Hundreds of thousands of people who had lived on that land for generations were forced out. There is a story, possibly legendary but powerful, that as Boabdil rode away from Granada and looked back at the Alhambra Palace for the last time, he wept. His mother, the story goes, said to him, "You weep like a woman for what you could not defend as a man." Whether that exchange actually happened, we cannot be sure, but the grief it describes was real. The Alhambra still stands today. Its walls are still covered in Arabic calligraphy. One phrase appears again and again throughout the palace: "La Ghalib illa Allah." There is no conqueror but God. It was the motto of the Nasrid dynasty who built it. Carved into stone, still there, still speaking. Now we move forward in time, to the early 1800s, to France, and to a story that sounds almost impossible, but is completely documented. In 1798, Napoleon Bonaparte led a French military expedition into Egypt. He brought soldiers, yes, but also scientists, historians, engineers, and artists. He was genuinely fascinated by Egyptian civilization. He wanted to understand it, document it, and in many ways learn from it. The campaign was militarily complicated and eventually unsuccessful. But while Napoleon was in Egypt, something happened that would follow him back to Europe. He encountered the Mamluks. The Mamluks were a military class with deep roots in Islamic history. Originally, they were enslaved soldiers, mostly from Central Asia and the Caucasus, who had been trained as elite warriors. Over centuries, they became so powerful that they formed their own dynasties. By the time Napoleon arrived in Egypt, the Mamluk cavalry were still legendary fighters, fearless, skilled, and deeply loyal to their own code. Napoleon was impressed, more than impressed. He was fascinated. And when he returned to France in 1799, a group of Mamluk soldiers came with him. Back in France, Napoleon formally organized them into a military unit, the Mamelukes de la Garde, the Mamluks of the Imperial Guard. This was not a symbolic role. The Imperial Guard was Napoleon's most elite fighting force. Being part of it was a serious honor. The Mamluk soldiers kept their identity. They wore their traditional uniforms, colorful turbans, robes, curved swords. They prayed. They fasted during Ramadan. They maintained their faith and their culture in the middle of the French Empire. And they fought. They fought in Spain during the Peninsular War. They fought in Germany. They fought in the brutal Russian campaign of 1812. These Muslim soldiers from Egypt rode through the snow outside Moscow, fighting under the French imperial flag. They rode through the streets of Paris. Ordinary Parisians stopped and stared. Some were confused. Some were curious. Some were afraid. But there they were, Muslim soldiers, in turbans and robes, at the very center of European power. And then there is the man who was closest to Napoleon of all. His name was Rustam Raza. Rustam was born around 1780 in what is now the Republic of Georgia. then a region with complex ties to the Ottoman world. As a young man, he was sold into slavery, trained as a Mamluk warrior in Cairo, and eventually presented to Napoleon as a gift during the Egyptian campaign. Napoleon took him into his personal service, and over the years, Roustam became something far more than a servant. He became Napoleon's personal bodyguard, one of the most trusted positions in the entire empire. For 14 years, Roustam slept on a mattress outside the door of Napoleon's bedroom. Every night, whether they were in Paris, in the field, or in a foreign capital, Roustam was there. He was present at every major battle. He was with Napoleon in Egypt, in Austria, in Spain, in Russia. He was there at Austerlitz. He was there at Waterloo's lead-up. He was, quite literally, always by Napoleon's side. He was Muslim. He prayed. He observed his faith. And he was the man the most powerful ruler in the Western world trusted with his life. Roustam eventually married a French woman. He had children. He became a French citizen. He lived out his life in France and died in 1845. French artists painted his portrait. His memoirs were published in French in 1911. You can still read them today. This is not a myth. This is documented history. 3 stories, 3 different places, 3 different centuries. A Muslim city in Sicily that was bigger and more advanced than anything else in Europe at the time. A civilization in Spain that preserved and expanded human knowledge for centuries, and whose influence shaped the European Renaissance. Muslim soldiers riding through Paris, and a Muslim man who slept outside Napoleon's door for 14 years. These are not stories from another world. They are European history. They are part of the same story that produced the France, the Spain, the Italy that exist today. History is almost always more complicated than the version we are taught. Stories get simplified. Certain chapters get left out. Not always deliberately, but because the full picture is harder to tell in a short lesson. But the full picture matters. Because when we understand that Muslims have been part of European life for over 1,200 years, not as strangers, not as invaders, but as builders, scholars, soldiers, and citizens, it changes how we think about the present. It does not erase the tensions or the difficult questions of today, but it gives them a deeper context, and context is the beginning of understanding.